My name is Connie Chung Joe, and I'm the CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. And I want to thank you for joining us at this panel discussion on the 30th anniversary of the LA Uprising, also known in Korean as Saigu. I remember April 29th, 1992, the day the verdict came down, acquitting 4 white police officers in the brutal beating of a Black man, Rodney King. 6 days of unrest unfolded, which resulted in 63 deaths and $1 billion in property damage. I saw smoke all over the city that day as I took the school bus home. And my parents said it was too dangerous for me to be outside, so I sat in front of the TV watching the violence unfold. And I heard about my friends, parents, and my own relatives on their business rooftop with guns. And I recall at church that weekend listening to the grown-ups talk about whose businesses had burned down, whose had been looted, who had property insurance, who would rebuild, and what would happen to those who wouldn't recover. I remember 6 months prior, the verdict in the murder of Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old Black girl who'd been shot in the back and killed by a Korean shop owner, Sunja Do. Although there were legitimate tensions between the Black and Korean communities, I still recall the shock and bewilderment across Los Angeles, including within the Korean community, of how the judge could sentence Do to community service with no jail time for the killing of a teenage girl. The result was a perfect example of the model minority myth. Our criminal justice system put the Korean immigrant woman's life at a higher value than that of a teenage girl who was Black. And when the verdict came down in the King beating just a few months later, it showed once again how anti-Black our criminal justice system was. And there was no wonder there was an uprising in Los Angeles at the incredible injustice, much like we saw all over the country and the world after George Floyd's murder. But the uprising had a disproportionate impact on Korean businesses whose businesses bore 40% of the damages. As Koreatown burned to the ground, while Korean business owners desperately called 911 for help to no avail. The government ignored the pleas of Korean Americans, while 5 miles away in Beverly Hills, it remained unscathed, protected on all sides by police and firefighters. The media framing of the Korean versus Black communities pitted these two communities against one another. Blacks were seen as burning down buildings and looting stores, and Koreans were vigilantes on store rooftops with guns shooting down on the street. There was no nuance or context around the systemic racism and oppression these communities were experiencing, leading up to, during, or after the uprising. As we think about how these two racial movements have taken the forefront of this pandemic, Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matter, it's a good opportunity to reflect back on what we know now about how systemic racism impacts our communities of colors and keeps us all down. Anti-Asian hate has been a rude wake-up call that we Asian Americans face discrimination, and the model minority myth has not served us well. It's not to say that all communities of color have experienced racism in the same way, as we must acknowledge the uniqueness of anti-Blackness in this country that goes back 400 years to when Blacks were treated not as subhuman, but as unhuman. Nearly 3 decades after Latasha Harlins, Rodney King, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others, it's a question of how much progress we've truly made. However, what I refuse to do is play a game of oppression Olympics in which marginalized communities fight against each other for scraps of attention and resources. Today's panel is not going to solve the long and complex history of racism in our country or heal all the trauma between the Korean and Black Korean and Asian communities. However, we are bringing together today some of our greatest civil rights leaders from 1992 with top media experts to unpack at least one component of this history, which is the media's role in what happened. We hope that through this panel, it will help the media to think about how they frame their coverage of the LA uprising over the next 2 weeks, as well as how they generally frame race and relations in future stories. And for the general public, when you read stories about the LA uprising or Saigu or other stories about communities of color, you can read them with a critical eye towards what gets told and what gets left out. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now pass it on to Monica Lozano, our moderator, who is the president of College Futures Foundation and the former CEO of La Opinión.
Thank you, Connie. I'm sorry, I had a hard time unmuting there, and that was such an excellent introduction and the framing for today's conversation. I so appreciate being here. Thank you to all of our guests. Welcome to this very important conversation. I also want to take us back 30 years. It was 30 years ago when I was executive editor of L'Opinion here in Los Angeles. And as the executive editor, I oversaw the newsroom, our journalists, our editors, our photographers, our coverage. And I like to say that our coverage was mission aligned and community based. Our reporters and editors lived in the communities that we covered. They were neighbors with the people that interacted with our media platforms on a daily basis. And it informed the way in which we covered not just our community, but the multiracial aspect of Los Angeles. And it was also during that period of time that I became familiar with and partnered with at least 3 of our esteemed panelists, Angela Oh, Connie Rice, and Stewart Kwoh, who were so committed at the time to not just elevate the issues of their community, but to build bridges across Los Angeles so that we could come together as a broad single community to tackle the sorts of issues that Connie just referenced. And it is from that perspective, as the executive editor of L'Opinion, as a member of this community that has for decades been committed to building those sorts of relationships. And as somebody who has participated in media, I bring that perspective to this discussion, and it is why it is such an honor to be with you here today. We are not going to be talking about Spanish language media. We are not going to be talking about the impact on the Latino community. As you heard, today's discussion is really about the situation between the Black and the Korean communities and the underlying structural racist systems that so disadvantaged entire communities for so long. So let me first now talk a little bit about format so we get a sense of how we're going to engage today. I'll be asking questions of our panelists for what now will be probably about the next 30 minutes or so. As you saw, please put your questions into chat because then we will open it up and take questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we've got a very limited period of time, so we won't be able to take all of your questions, but please feel free to submit them. And then also, as you've heard, we are live streaming on Advancing Justice, Asian American Advancing Justice Facebook page. So we hope you're able to tune in there. So let's go now to the discussion. And Angela, Connie framed it so well in terms of where were we 30 years ago? But let me just remind us one more time. As you recall, not in April of 1992, but going back to March of 1991. That was when the video tape was recorded that showed the brutal beating of Rodney King. And that videotape on a handheld camcorder taken by a local resident was then taken to KTLA, a local television station, who aired it, and then it was distributed nationally. And it began the conversation around race relations in Los Angeles that became part of the national discourse for well over a year. As you've heard, it was the four LA police officers who were then charged with excessive use of force and assault with a deadly weapon. Those 4 officers were later, it was on April the 29th, 1992, when the verdict came in that found them to be not guilty, acquitted on all charges. And so Connie Rice, I want to go to you with the first question, because that verdict may have been the spark that triggered the LA uprising, but the causes were deep-rooted and long-standing. So can you talk to us about the situation facing Black Angelenos 30 years ago that led to our understanding of this population and the issues facing them? Yeah, we're having a hard time unmuting ourselves.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
There we go.
Oh, Monica, it's so good to see everybody. And yes, at the kindling that verdict lit had been building for generations. And I think when we talk about Black LA, we have to talk about which Black LA. And I think that for working class African Americans and underclass, very poor African Americans, Los Angeles in the 80s and the 90s, and so even going back to 1965, when we had the first uprisings and rebellions against abusive policing, that kindling had been building. And you remember the McCone Commission, that autopsy on that riot said that you have to do two things. You have to end the spiral of despair, the conditions of deprivation and lack of opportunity, lack of resources, and you have to end the brutal, cruel, racist policing. Fast forward to 1991, what had we done in the meantime? For working class and poor African America, they had seen 80,000 jobs leave the South Central area. All the manufacturing base of the community left. There wasn't even a blue ribbon committee formed. The paper covered very little. The mainstream and dominant media didn't cover it very much. It was covered somewhat in the African American paper, the Sentinel, the Los Angeles Sentinel. But when your entire economic base and job base leaves, you're going to have a real gap there, and people fell through the cracks. You had an emerging and sort of burgeoning gang culture. And of course, the dominant media covered most of Black LA as deprivation and violence, because that's what the elite communities feared. It was done through the eyes of the subscriber base, which is natural. But for the dominant media, the focus on these communities didn't talk about what they were facing. We were focused on building skyscrapers downtown. We weren't focused on building communities and building families and reinvesting in the infrastructure that created the upward mobility. At the same time that African Americans and very poor African Americans who never had any stake and never any place at the table of prosperity in LA, they were having an influx of lots of immigrants. Latinos, there was a time of transition, it was a time of turmoil, and it was a time of not having, the city did nothing to help these populations learn to live together as opposed to being pit against each other. So I think that what the city of Los Angeles did, these were communities and these were people who did not matter. And the only time that they were covered in the dominant media, which was just a few organs, we didn't have 500 channels back then, was through the lens of what the mainstream elite feared about those communities. They didn't understand, didn't know, and didn't have a connection to. And poor African Americans would come to me and say, we're not sharing our crumbs. We were here first, and these people are coming in with resources we don't have. And Karen Bass and Stewart Kwoh and Connie Rice and Angela Oh, we were trying to create civic glue so that we could bridge the differences and make the pie bigger. But I think that the media didn't cover that context. They didn't cover the failure to address the policing. It didn't cover the failure to provide the economic infrastructure. And I think, Monica, what we ended up with was kindling, building and building and building, abuse after abuse, beating after beating. The police were really stoking, they were the lighter fluid. And that when those acquittals came down, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. I picked up the phone and I called my staff and I said, get your kids, go home. The city is going to burn. And when it burned, the Korean American and Korean immigrant community took the brunt of it, over $1 billion. And instead, what the media, mainstream media, focused on was the 1% of the shops who had owners who could defend themselves. And I think that there's been very little healing in the wake of it. And I don't think there's been very much interest from the media in any of those perspectives.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Connie. Excellent segue, because Angela, I'd like to go to you next. And I'm actually going to read something that you wrote as you reflected on this particular Saigu. And what you said here is that Korean Americans have paid the price that all racial and ethnic minorities in the United States eventually must pay. You go on to say, Saigu commemorates those who sacrificed their lives so that the message of our permanence in this society can be delivered. And I found that to be so profound. What did you mean when you talked about the message of our permanence and having to sacrifice lives to be able to attain this?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's good to see everyone. And this month, every year, does raise the memory of 92 and many years after that, frankly. So when I think about the impact and the trauma that was visited upon small immigrant store owners here in Los Angeles, I can say that I spent probably 3 years visiting various parts of this country. If your identity was ethnic Korean, you were shaken by what you saw. I spent much of that time with faith-based organizations, with student organizations, with civic engagement organizers who heard the message that, yeah, we need to engage more fully in the society that we have come to, called the United States. And the impact was a deep, deep trauma and confusion. I used to also say that we live in parallel universes. So it's certainly in the case of the Korean community in Los Angeles at that time, I was an unusual bird because I was second generation, born and raised in Los Angeles. I, at the time, was in practice doing criminal defense work and very active with civil rights issues. And, you know, the fact of the beating was not news to the communities that I was connected to professionally. We knew that the kinds of things that were captured on that video that night were common, unfortunately. Back in those days, in order to settle a matter, you had to sign confidentiality terms, otherwise you would not get your settlement check. For the Korean community, they had no idea about this sort of thing because they were mostly first generation, as they are now. And they are reading the Korean news. And what are they reading? They're reading sort of the same thing, but not entirely. They are reading also about people being assaulted, burglarized, killed in their small businesses. And people have asked me, well, why were they in those communities? This was where they could go, right? And they didn't have any special programs. They brought a custom and practice that people started to learn about after 92. This is how they gathered their funds. They would create small groups of hopefully trusted people, and they would pool their money. And there's something called a Kwoh. Many of the folks perhaps listening tonight know about this. And the purpose back in Korea was, you know, you pool your resources so people could have weddings, people could do funerals, people could have celebrations of all kinds, and here start businesses. I mean, I was in court one day and I saw a Korean American lawyer being almost ridiculed by a bench officer because he was there on a breach of contract case. And the judge said, "Are you here telling me that you're trying to recover money in a situation where there's no written contract and you have no information about where this person has gone with the funds?" And, you know, I couldn't believe what I was hearing because this lawyer was, I think, one of the pioneers of trying to introduce, you know, cultural practices that a place like Los Angeles needed to know, and has since learned. But, you know, the impact on the small business owners who did survive was not just the loss, but they who had been paying premiums for commercial insurance found that their carriers were offshore. They couldn't recover on the claims that they were trying to make. Everyone already knows that there was no response to calls for help. But these sorts of issues, being caught up in the gray market, the issues around suicide that followed, which didn't get covered in any media, you know, the issues of children having to give up their futures because they had to help their parents rebuild. All those people came through my office at one point or another, and it was truly dispiriting. I don't know, am I supposed to say more, Monica?
No.
You know, I will say one more thing that I'd like to in this space.
If you know what, Angela, I couldn't unmute, so let me just go on to Stewart if you don't mind, and then I'll come back around to you.
Sure.
Sorry, we're having trouble with the mute button here, but so I actually want to pick up on what you were saying about, and both you and Connie, about what was or wasn't being covered in the dominant media. And Stewart, I was reflecting on something that I had read, which is that there was a writer at the Korea Times who was so concerned by the headline writing, the way in which the LA Times was covering the incidents of those 5 days, that he actually wrote a letter to the editor and said, you need to tone it down. This is actually inciting not only greater misunderstanding, but adding fuel to the flame that Connie referenced. And you played a really important role, Stewart, in actually, and this isn't just about the LA Times, but actually bringing to the attention the LA Times, the way in which they were covering, and we can use this as a proxy for the dominant media, but the way in which they were covering the communities, as Angela and Connie both said, the stories that were not being told, and the way in which the depictions were actually advancing the kinds of stereotypes that we know are inaccurate.
Thank you, Monica. I grew up in Los Angeles since I was a baby. And I think the conclusion I have is that multiracial democracy really depends on media that's fair, accurate, and avoids pitting one group against another unnecessarily. And that was the point that I and people like Angela and others made when we protested the LA Times coverage. We went to the LA Times, we met with Shelby Coffey, then the editor, and we said, I don't know if it's 1%, as Connie mentioned, but a very small percentage of Korean Americans tried to protect their businesses with guns. But that was the only picture that was starkly shown by the LA Times. A few Korean Americans with guns on rooftops shooting down on people. And that picture definitely fanned the flames. It wasn't accurate. It wasn't balanced. It took everything out of context. So the injustices that Connie and Angela talked about, the economic injustice, the criminal injustice, and the racial tensions were all covered by that picture. And so we confronted the LA Times. There were about 15 of us who went into the office. We had an appointment, and Shelby actually agreed with us. On the spot, he appointed a reporter to cover the Asian American community. And then within a couple of months, he looked for the best Asian American reporter in California and chose Connie Chung, who reported for over 10 years and was a good reporter in that she deeply understood the community. It wasn't about race, but it was about having reporters, as you said, Monica, who live in the community, who know the community, who speak the language of the community, and could really understand the issues. And so when we filed 1,400 complaints against the police for deserting South LA and Central LA, she covered it. When we sued the 10 offshore insurance companies for not paying anything to the store owners. She covered it. And incidentally, we had to sue the agents because all 10 insurance companies went bankrupt. So, you know, by going into the stories, you did find interest. You did find, you know, some spectacular injustices, but you actually found out much more about what was happening than just those pictures of a few merchants with guns. So I think that the lesson I learned is that you do have to confront the powers that be at times to say what's right and what's wrong, because if you don't, you just accept a media that actually could damage a multiracial democracy and not uphold a multiracial democracy.
Jarrett, I want to bring you in now. Jarrett Hill, who is a professor at the USC Annenberg School and also president of the National Association of Black Journalists. And clearly your role is a little different, not having been a protagonist in 1992, but hearing this conversation about the role that media plays in advancing inclusive democracy. And so as you think about what you've heard, both in terms of the misrepresentation, the advancing stereotypes, the not understanding context, not having reporters that are from the communities that they are assigned to report on. How do you think about ways in which media can, in fact, pivot to do it better? What are the ways in which, you know, we can build context and understand the role of both advancing democracy and building bridges across a multiracial society?
Well, Monica, first of all, thank you for having me and thank you for the question. I think that one of the things that we have to do first is recognize that the media's goal has never been to uphold like a multiracial democracy, right? Mm-hmm. Like upholding a diverse democracy, or, you know, even really supporting or encouraging a diverse culture and society has never really been the priority of media, right? It's been to make money. And so when we think about that and we think about who the dominant culture is, and, you know, there's a lot of conversation about how we name that, right? Whether it's dominant culture, mainstream culture, however we say that, it's always been to cater to that audience, right? And so for the Black and brown folks who come along, who happen to stumble into the conversation, great, we're really excited to get your numbers as well, right? And so the upholding or supporting of a multiracial, diverse democracy has never really been the focus or never been the goal. And so I think that when we look into the newsrooms and our editors and our directors and our news managers and all of those different roles, that they're also reflective of that, right? In the advocacy work that we do at NABJLA and the conversations I've had with my students at USC and the listeners that I have on the show that we talk to that are from around the world, we are always kind of reiterating, like, I mean, colloquially, like, y'all know this isn't what the whole purpose of the system was, right? Like, we're trying to like change a system, right? We're trying to bend it to the needs of what we need it to reflect now. And so this is as good a demonstration of the need for diversity in our newsrooms, but not just in our internships, right? And not just for the reporters, but for the editors, for the managers, for the directors, for the general managers, for the owners of the companies, to have more of a reflection of the community, because without that, we don't get the nuance that we've been talking about, right? That Connie talked about, that you've talked about, that Stewart has talked about, that Angela's talked about. Like, yeah, these things happened, but we talked about them in this way and it did this, right? I've been talking with my students most recently. A lot of our conversation right now is at this time of the school year has been around social media. And one of the things that we've been unpacking is these great documentaries on Britney Spears and the ways in which she went into her conservatorship. But such a big part of the conversation is the media and the social media and how we have, really guided that conversation and steered that story in a way that it didn't have to go, right? The past couple of weeks, we've been talking about Will Smith and Chris Rock and the race element of that conversation and the way that media and social media and the audience really kind of drives the conversation. And so when we're thinking about how that happens even pre-social media, when we're talking about this scenario, but also the scenarios that follow it, I think it's important that we always recognize, like, one, what these systems were set up to do, but then second, the ways in which we can begin to change them and be more inclusive and diverse and equitable, right, for all of the buzzwords, to be able to better address the community issues that we are creating, but also exacerbating.
Thank you. Excellent. And I actually want to now pick up a question that came in through the chat. And Connie Rice, I'm going to direct it to you because it builds directly off of what Jarrett was just saying. And it's interesting because I've heard both you, Angela and Stewart, reference, well, here we are again on the anniversary of, 5 years, 10 years, 15. And, I don't want to say having the same conversation, but, it's when it becomes, part of the discourse, and it shouldn't just be around an anniversary, but, something that we talk about. And so the question here, it was actually posed this way, that soon enough that the people that are leading the conversation on the 92 uprising will be people who never lived through it. So how can we ensure that journalism is accurate and trustworthy for the future generations, and that they can have accurate conversations that contribute to the much needed policy changes that you all have been talking about?
I don't know that they can. The media, the terrain of journalism and the coverage of public issues is just so different. 30 years ago, there were maybe 5 newspapers. Newspapers have gone through this cannibalistic, pirate capitalism. They've just been shredded. And so all of the research capacity, I can remember, I would always go to the City Times section, the LA Times, not to pick on the LA Times, but there was the Daily News and the LA Times as the 2 sort of dominant papers. And the Times, to kind of answer these criticisms from community advocates like us, as well as from community-based papers that really did do the point of view of our different sets of diaspora communities, immigrant communities, indigenous communities. There were some organs, and then the LA Times did City Times, and that was the section of the paper that gave the point of view of mainly African American and Latino. I can't say that any of the Asian Pacific Island different sets of subcommunities were in. I can remember one article that included something about African Americans and Korean shop owners, but that went away. And now today there are more sections of the dominant papers for Hollywood, and yet they missed the Me Too. So as someone who does not participate in social media, I see an even more destructive set of physics to multiracial democracy, to building civic glue, to building bridges. We seem to have hatchets out for one another. And I don't think that I think the media is even less oriented toward building anything. It seems to just be wanting to survive. So for young journalists, I think you've got to fight. I think you've got to fight for the resources to cover these issues. I think you've got to fight to get the articles that cover both the conflicts as well as the emerging alliances in these communities, because they're not really of interest to people who are all about making money or about entertaining. And that seems to be the major focus. As the professor said, it's not about building multiracial democracy. It's not about building anything. It's about making money. And so when so when you have a journalist covering South Los Angeles and the violence, give the context to that. And I remember when Jill Leovy, I'll never forget having to go to the LA Times like Stewart did. And I said, there's an epidemic of youth gang homicides in South LA. There's an epidemic of gang homicides. There are 7,000 unsolved murders just in South Bureau. Where are the articles? And they said, murder's too common there to cover it.
Wow.
And that was when the journalist Jill Leovy wrote her book, Ghetto Side, about the fact that this community's trauma, deep trauma, and just as the Korean immigrant and Korean American trauma was never covered, it's still going on. I have conversations with my Korean American colleagues. The trauma is still there. The conversations between the African American community and the Black community haven't happened. We haven't healed that breach, that injury, and the leadership to do that, I don't think is helped by any of the coverage that you're going to get in any kind of mainstream media. I can't really answer that question, Monica. I just don't see a media terrain, and I'm not blaming the journalists, because the journalists, I think, have a very, very hard time now being able to cover substance in depth. It's constant content generation. It's 24 hours a day. Everything is shallow. There's no in-depth. I talked to journalists who haven't read the Christopher Commission report, the McCone Commission, the Colts Commission. They haven't read any of Joe Dominic's books on LAPD, and yet they're covering policing in this region. They don't even know that there are 44 police agencies. So I find that the resources for journalism, the support for journalists is getting thinner and thinner. And therefore, what we're talking about in terms of the kind of coverage that builds, I think is harder and harder.
So let me just open it up, Connie, thank you, to see if Jarrett or Stewart or Angela have anything they want to add or reaction to what you just heard. And I'm concerned about this notion of the parallel universe. And I remember I lived across the street from a woman who was on the editorial board for the LA Times, and she would say, you know, I pick up our paper in the morning, I pick up your paper, and I feel like I'm reading about two different cities. And how do we heal as a community? How do we overcome the trauma? How do we actually, you know, build those relationships that you all are talking about, understand the structural inequities that have led to the current circumstances? I'd love to hear. I see many of you came off mute. Angela, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Connie, for that perspective. I think that you're right on. I'm not sure we can. We're living in a time when there are so many different channels, and people can really just choose what they want to hear. And that's why we have the problem we have with the meta discourse that we see in the country. In fact, you know, how can masks be as controversial as they are? But they are. And it's a symptom of, you know, the fact that we don't seem to hold anything sacred anymore. I will tell you what I've been doing for the last 30 years. First, I did a lot of dialogue work, and you know, I've always said, wow, I'd like to write a book. And in fact, my goal was to get one done by the 30th. Well, that hasn't happened. So, but I have just seen so much that gives me hope, actually. Here in Southern Cal, we have something called the Black API Healing Circle. It was intended for us to just meet 4 times. I was going to do some training with some colleagues up north and here, Lady Bird Morgan and Orland Bishop and Sean Evans, and we wanted to put together a space where we could just hold people in whatever it was that they needed to compost with regard to the Black Asian tensions and conflicts. We were only going to do 4 and train people to go out and do more circles. We've been meeting now for 2 years, and you know, through COVID, and the relationship is so deep. We can cry with one another. We can express deep anger and regret about things. And now we're seeing that there are more people that are needing this kind of space. So that's one thing. Another thing is we have to stay connected to the reality that things aren't the same as they were 30 years ago. So whatever I have to say about what I did, it really isn't relevant to what needs to happen going forward. But I'm a big one that believes that, you know, the past, we don't forget it. We carry it in who we are. It's in our bones. The future is just an imagination, and that's what Hollywood does very well, and it can make all kinds of stories up. I don't think it's a mistake that the narrative form, by the way, has become so popular in every sector where people are doing narratives. Why? Because they're not getting the depth and the texture and the thoughtfulness. And I see it all as very tied to education failing in this country. We've lost our ability to think critically, I think, because we're so used to having been conditioned to become consumers. That's what we do. We consume things, ideas, and information. But where is the thinking of anything original, creative? And then where is the kindness? You know, everything is about a fight, a win or a lose. I'm looking for people who want to develop their capacity to be kind again and to be generous in a time of scarcity and fear and violence, frankly. I feel for this man who's just been picked up. It was a horrible thing that happened in Brooklyn. And yet it's clear to me there's mental disability here. There's a mental illness. And we went and unfunded all of our community mental health clinics during the Reagan administration. We are living with the impact of that now.
Jarrett, I saw you came off mute. Do you want to?
I mean, we could talk about this for 3 days, right? Like, I mean, there's plenty of it to talk about here. One of the things that I think is really important, and I'll preface this by saying I just became a college professor, so Constance, when you referenced me as the professor, I was like, who is she talking about? And it's like, I'm still getting used to that. But one of the things that when I was reaching out to friends, talking to them about maybe taking this job and getting their feedback on why you should definitely do it, was they were like, oh, the students will keep you young. And I'm like, I mean, I feel like I'm pretty young. I'm doing all right, you know. But talking with the students now, I'm always intrigued by their perspective and the way that they are social justice empowered and educated. And also, though, they have a kindness and a compassion that surprises me, that I didn't feel like I saw when I was growing up. But we also have to recognize, like, these are students who have lived through Donald Trump as president, right? Who have lived through COVID, who have lived through the 2016 election and how that whole thing went. They've lived through Barack Obama being the first Black president of the United States. And so they have a lens that is different than the lens I had when I was in college, right? And so I think that to your question about, like, what do we do? I think part of what we need to be thinking about is, how do we always make sure that we're bringing the history to the contemporary, right? I've been really fascinated by the students' questions about the ways that things work. And I make sure that when we're talking about the television system, right now I'm teaching an entertainment and pop culture class. And when we're talking about the entertainment system or television or film or whatever it is, we always make sure that we have a conversation about the ways that race play in that space, right? And one of my students was like, I love that we're talking about critical race theory. And I was like, that's not even, girl, no, right? Like, I'm just talking about race, right? And how race impacts these conversations. And I think that when we continue to do that, and when we continue to be thoughtful about what we're centering in our conversation, I think we can also start to have an impact on being able to shift people's ideas, to make people just think an extra moment, to have a little bit more of a thought process around the stories that we're telling, the ways that we're telling those stories, the words that we're using, and the ones that we're not, right? The things that we're centering in on and the things that we're not paying attention to. And I say we to include me, right? Because, like, I'm trying to be better about all of it, but I think we all have a lot of work to do to be able to change this system, because in reality, getting this system to be what we need it to be may be impossible, right? But I think we can do a lot of work to try to make it better.
Really appreciate what you said about talking about race. Go ahead, Stewart.
Yeah, I wanted to make a few points. One is, I agree that newspapers and the media are under a lot of pressure, but I think it's very important for people in this webinar to uphold what we think needs to happen, what we expect from the media, what we expect to uphold multiracial democracy. Otherwise, we're lost. Because if we just let everything fall apart, then we really are lost. So we have to uphold what our goals should be with regards to what we expect the media to perform. If they could cover the Ukraine left and right, they could cover our communities as well. The other thing I just wanted to say is this is a time that really pushes the need for ethnic studies, because the media may not cover the true histories of our communities. So in addition to working with advancing justice, I'm working with the Asian American Education Project, and we're finding a huge hunger around the country where our curriculum of 53 lesson plans is in 10 states already. And we're working on stories not only about Asian Americans, but how Asian Americans have worked with Black Americans, have worked with Latinx. Recently, I was given a Lifetime Achievement Award at Maldef's dinner. And I told this story about how Filipino American farm workers joined with the Mexican American farm workers to start the UFW, the United Farm Workers. And people love that story. People are hungry for the truth about what has happened in our communities.
So there's a question that came in also from the audience, and I'm gonna blend it a little bit with the last question that I'll be able to ask. And the question was, has the coverage of the Asian American community improved since 1992? And I would ask that question also, Connie Rice of the Black community in Los Angeles. Have we seen advances in the way we're understood, depicted, the issues are being covered? And the blend is with the question of, if media is going to turn its attention again to the anniversary of the LA Uprising, what would you encourage them to avoid? So that the narrative actually becomes more nuanced and is shaped by the kind of conversation that we just had. Let me start with Connie Rice.
Sorry, there's a jet going over. It's really, really loud. I think that things have improved. I was impressed by in the wake of the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests, where 20 million Americans took to the streets to protest, not just an atrocious murder by police officer, but also a criminal justice system that has racked up, has really earned the title, the new Jim Crow. I mean, we've done mass incarceration, we've done terrible things to poor communities of color and poor white communities in this country. And I think that lens is often the systemic and structural and policy ways that we crush these communities just isn't portrayed. The dots are not connected. The picture isn't painted in enough detail. And our connection, those of us who don't live in poverty, our connection and how we benefit from their impoverishment, our connection to their deprivation is never covered. So I think that the ability to connect those dots and show the whole system and how each of us plays a role and is a beneficiary or a victim of it, I think is missing across the communities. I do think that the coverage, especially with the Black Lives Matter protests, and we had the national reckoning on race for about 5 minutes, and media started. And media no, it's over now. We're going back to Blue Lives Matter, right? But no, I'm just kidding. But in the wake of that, I saw dominant media taking an introspective look at the mistakes they had made in covering the Asian Pacific American communities and covering the African American communities, because there are multiple communities in each of these subworlds. LA is a land of 1,000 tribes, and within each tribe there are different levels. So you're never going to get your mind around it, but trying to get the relationships and the people who are curious enough to get into some of these communities the way that Stewart went to the LA Times, is that we need someone who can actually understand us, our immigrant and our immigrant communities as well, and the different levels there, as well as the communities that are folks who have been here for hundreds of years. So I think things have gotten better. I've seen improvement, but I also see the limited lens continuing. And I see the lack of connecting the dots that many of us see, but that the mainstream culture doesn't see. And we are also blind. I've got blinders too, and I'm not aware of the multitudes that live within this incredible region. And we need media that meets the magic of our multicultural tapestry, and we don't have it yet.
Jarrett, I saw you raise your hand, and then I'm going to ask Stewart to make a final comment, and Angela as well, and then we'll invite Connie Chung Joe back in.
That puts a lot of pressure on this statement now, Monica. I want to let you know. But I will just say, I think to Constance's point, and really to the broader conversation about like how things have changed or if they're changing, I think we see some great progress. Right. I think we see, diversity numbers moving in certain ways. I think we see, at the Los Angeles Times, as we've used that example, we've seen, there's a Black LA reporter. We see our first Black person on the masthead, and we see over the last couple of years that's, kind of evolved and grown. I think we also have to make sure that when we get folks in those roles, one, that we're able to get great folks in those roles, but like that they're able to bring other people in behind them. And I think also we have to not expect that one person to be representative of an entire community, right? And I think that so often, any person who is in media that is a part of a marginalized group or have some kind of marginalized intersection can tell you about what it is like to have to come speak for all Black people, right? Or what it is like to speak for all queer people, or what it is like to have to speak for all people that are a part of one lane of your intersection. And I think that the more we can start seeing ourselves in all of these different kinds of roles, the more often we'll get the nuance that is necessary to cover a story like this in a way that is equitable and honest and of value to all of the communities, as opposed to just being of value to the bottom line.
Stewart, did you have a final comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just think we've taken one step forward and one step backward. Like as an example, the LA Times did improve after the meeting I organized in 1992. We actually gave them awards for the progress that they made. But just 2 years ago, there was a protest mainly by the minority reporters at the LA Times that progress had really slipped back. And so they didn't, particularly Black and Latinx reporters and people on the masthead were either absent or in very low numbers. So I think in the Asian community, the newspapers have been pressured by the economy and by the pressures of keeping up a newspaper. And so the newspapers have fallen into trying to appeal to their slice of the pie, their division. So I don't think you get the broad coverage that at one time you had, where reporters actually tried to figure out what was happening in other communities other than their own. So I think it is a tense time. I think that the lesson I've learned is that people like us, people in the audience tonight, have to be vigilant. They have to speak up, because if you don't speak up, people will not listen. The business imperatives will just take people down a certain channel, and it'll be hard to pick up. So you have to be vigilant. You have to speak up. You have to protest. You have to rally. Otherwise, we could be lost.
Angela?
Yeah, I think we have to appreciate the complexity of the life that we're all living today. It's become far, far more complex. And beyond that, at least in the API community, we have in-language media or media sources that are not going to be English, and they reflect, I think, different values than what we see in Western society. At least I'm speaking in terms of the Asian and Asian media. And so for me, I find it fascinating right now, the posture that we're in relationship to what's happening here locally and what's happening internationally, and that includes at our southern border. So I feel like the complexity invites new generations of journalists or people who are thinking about where we're heading as a people to interrogate the story more deeply, look for what are the sources beyond what's being provided in the story that you're seeing. Look for some creativity too. This is what I would really appreciate. As we're talking, I'm thinking about, geez, there's so many things around intergenerational pieces that could be generated. There's so many things about customs and traditions that we could learn in the case of Koreans beyond BTS and K-pop and Korean dramas. So I really, really would hope that people not be afraid of the complexity of the times in which we live.
Well, I want to thank all of you, Angela Oh, Connie Rice, Stewart Kwoh, and Jarrett Hill. It has been fascinating. I appreciate so much all that you've done to be vigilant, as Stewart said, to be compassionate and kind, to not give up, and to remind ourselves that this is a journey, and we have to work together to move forward. So thank you, Connie Chung Joe and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, for putting together this panel, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I don't know if you can all see my screen, but I'm so grateful for our brilliant speakers, Connie Rice, Angela Oh, Stewart Kwoh, and Jarrett Hill, and Monica for moderating this panel so seamlessly. And I want to thank all of our audience for being here tonight. And I'd like to put a plug in. This event was a retrospective panel looking back 30 years ago. And we did it 2 weeks before the actual date of Saigu, so that way we could think about what the coverage looks like in the next few weeks. On April 29th itself, Advancing Justice LA is hosting a peace gathering with it organized with 5 other organizations, which is the LA Urban League, First AME Church, Koreatown Youth Community Center, Korean American Coalition, and Korean American Federation. And this event will be targeted towards a younger audience. We have rappers, we have R&B, we have pop performers, we'll have gospel singers, we'll have Korean dancers, we will have a mixture of performances, food trucks, entertainment, but all of the folks that we are going to be uplifting will be Korean and Black. And so if you are interested in that event, I encourage you to check it out in Koreatown on April 29th from 4 to 7. And I have the registration link. We expect anywhere from 500 to a few thousand people to come out that night. And want to say to any media, if you would like to do any follow-up interviews or discussions with our panelists tonight, you can email communications@advancingjusticeLA.org, and we can follow up with you to do interview with our speakers. So thank you all again so much for sharing your evening with us, and appreciate all that you do. Good night.